What if the meals that powered the Industrial Revolution just vanished from our kitchens? In Victorian England, factory workers labored 14-hour days for wages that barely covered rent. Yet somehow they survived. They fed entire families on pennies. The secret was a collection of cheap, filling foods that most of us have completely forgotten. These weren't gourmet dishes, they were survival meals designed to squeeze every possible calorie from the cheapest possible ingredients. Some of them sound bizarre today, others might actually deserve a comeback. From mysterious meat pastes to boiled animal parts that would make modern diners squirm, Victorian workers turned poverty into pure culinary creativity. Let's dig into 15 cheap meals that kept entire cities alive and discover what we've been missing. First up, a breakfast so simple it barely counts as cooking. Bread and dripping was the ultimate factory floor fuel. This simple meal consisted of nothing more than bread slathered with the leftover fat from roasting meat. When a family cooked their Sunday roast, they carefully saved every drop of dripping that collected in the pan. That greasy residue became breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner for the rest of the week. The fat spread like butter, but packed far more calories. For workers facing 14-hour shifts of physical labor, those calories weren't just welcome, they were essential. Bread and dripping was the Victorian equivalent of energy bars, except it was literally just fat on carbs. No fancy packaging required. What made this meal particularly clever was its cost. The dripping was essentially free, a byproduct of cooking that would otherwise be thrown away. A penny's worth of bread could feed a worker for an entire day when paired with enough fat. Factory records from the 1860s show workers eating bread and dripping at dawn, often standing up before walking miles to their shifts. If dripping could fill out a job application, it would list maximum calories from minimum ingredients as its primary qualification. The taste was surprisingly appealing. Good beef dripping had a rich, savory flavor that complemented crusty bread perfectly. Some families added a sprinkle of salt. Others scraped up the brown jellied bits from the bottom of the dripping bowl, which contained the most flavor. Modern cooking methods eventually killed bread and dripping. As ovens became more efficient and families roasted meat less frequently, the dripping supply dried up. We essentially declared war on free calories because we stopped making them. While bread and dripping provided pure fuel, another humble dish offered something more substantial. Peas pudding was the protein powerhouse of Victorian poverty. Made from dried split peas, boiled for hours until they collapsed into a thick, stodgy mass, this dish could feed a family for days on ingredients costing almost nothing. The versatility was remarkable. Workers ate peas pudding hot with their evening meal, cold the next morning, and fried in slices by the third day. If vegetables could file for overtime, peas pudding would have been working triple shifts. The famous nursery rhyme about peas pudding hot and peas pudding cold wasn't just a children's song. It was a description of actual weekly meal planning. Peas pudding delivered protein when meat was unaffordable. A pot of it could stretch across an entire week, growing denser and more filling with each reheating. Peas pudding was the Victorian equivalent of meal prep, except the container was an iron pot, and the prep lasted all week. Modern grocery stores eventually made fresh vegetables affordable year-round, and this ancient staple quietly disappeared from British tables. Gruel has the worst reputation of any food in history. Thanks to Charles Dickens, most people picture a thin, gray slop served to miserable orphans. The reality was considerably more nutritious than fiction suggests. Victorian gruel was essentially oatmeal that had been through an austerity program. Workers made it by boiling oats in water until everything dissolved into a smooth, drinkable consistency. Wealthier families added milk or a splash of cream. Poorer families made do with water and a pinch of salt. Either way, it filled bellies and provided energy that lasted for hours. What made gruel genuinely valuable was its digestibility. After a long shift of physical labor, exhausted workers needed food that wouldn't sit heavy in their stomachs. Gruel went down easy and stayed down. Factory records from Manchester in the 1850s show gruel being served in workplace canteens, specifically because it caused fewer digestive complaints than heavier meals. Gruel was the Victorian equivalent of a protein shake, except it cost almost nothing and required zero marketing. The association with poverty eventually killed gruel's reputation. By the late Victorian era, middle-class families had rebranded the exact same dish as porridge and served it in respectable breakfast rooms. Same oats, same cooking method, completely different social status. If foods could sue for defamation, gruel would have an excellent case. While gruel suffered from bad press, tripe and onions faced a different challenge entirely. This dish consisted of cow stomach lining slowly stewed with onions in milk or broth until tender. Victorian workers didn't have the luxury of being picky. They ate stomach and called it dinner. The texture takes some getting used to. Tripe has a distinctive honeycomb pattern and a chewy consistency that modern diners often find challenging. What made tripe economically brilliant was its price. Butchers practically gave the stuff away because wealthier customers refused to buy it. A family could purchase enough tripe to feed everyone for less than the cost of a single pork chop. The protein content rivaled expensive cuts of meat at a fraction of the cost. Regional pride turned tripe into a competitive sport. Lancashire and Yorkshire families argued for generations about the proper preparation method. Tripe was the Victorian equivalent of barbecue rivalry, except instead of brisket versus pulled pork, it was milk-stewed stomach versus clear broth stomach. Modern squeamishness eventually pushed tripe off British menus. Most grocery stores stopped carrying it entirely, and an entire generation grew up never knowing what their great-grandparents considered completely ordinary food. Faggots might have the most unfortunately named survival food in British history. The word originally meant bundle, which makes sense once you understand what went into them. Victorian cooks took all the organ meats that butchers couldn't sell, minced them together with breadcrumbs and herbs, and shaped the mixture into balls. Liver, heart, lungs, and whatever else was available all ended up in the same pot. Faggots were the Victorian equivalent of smoothies, except instead of blending kale and berries, you were blending every internal organ nobody else wanted. The preparation required skill. Cooks wrapped each ball in caul fat, the lacy membrane surrounding a pig's organs, then baked them until crispy on the outside and tender within. Served with thick onion gravy and mashed potatoes, faggots became a genuinely satisfying meal. The iron content alone would impress modern nutritionists, and the protein density rivaled expensive cuts of beef. Regional pride kept faggots alive longer than most Victorian survival foods. Parts of the Midlands and Wales still serve them today, though many younger Britons have never tried them. The dish that once fed factory workers by the thousands now survives mainly in specialty shops and nostalgic pubs. While faggots made something substantial from scraps, bread and scrape represented poverty at its most basic. This wasn't really a meal so much as a technique for making butter last impossibly long. The concept was simple. Take a piece of bread. Apply the thinnest possible layer of butter or margarine, scraping the knife across so lightly that the fat barely tinted the surface. Bread and scrape is what happens when you zoom in on bread and butter until the butter becomes purely theoretical. For many factory families, Scrape weeks were a regular occurrence. When wages ran short before payday, mothers stretched a single pat of butter across dozens of slices. Children ate bread and scrape for breakfast, sometimes for lunch as well. The contrast with wealthier households was stark. Rich families spread butter generously without thinking. Poor families made a week's worth from what the rich used in a single morning. Bread and scrape was the Victorian equivalent of running on fumes, except the fumes were a memory of butter that had already been spread on 3 other slices. What killed bread and scrape was the eventual cheapness of margarine. By the early 20th century, even poor families could afford to spread their bread properly. The survival technique that had stretched pennies for generations became unnecessary, and nobody particularly missed it. Bloaters announced themselves long before they reached the table. The smell was distinctive, to put it politely. These whole salted and smoked herring got their memorable name from the way they swelled during the smoking process, puffing up into plump, oily fish that could be stored for weeks without refrigeration. Herring were among the cheapest protein sources available to Victorian workers. The fish swarmed in such abundance around British coasts that even the poorest families could afford them. Fishermen salted and smoked their catch in massive quantities, creating a preserved food that traveled well and lasted indefinitely. Bloaters were the Victorian equivalent of meal prep, except the prep had been done by fishermen 3 weeks earlier, and it definitely showed. Eating a bloater required technique. Workers consumed them whole, bones and all, developing impressive skills at separating flesh from skeleton using nothing but their tongues and teeth. Children learned young. A skilled bloater eater could strip a fish clean in minutes, leaving behind a perfect skeleton. If eating competitions had existed in Victorian times, bloater deboning would have been a championship event. The decline of bloaters came with improved transportation. Once fresh fish could reach inland cities without spoiling, the appeal of eating something that smelled like it had been stored in a fisherman's boot for a month decreased substantially. Modern Britons occasionally encounter bloaters in specialty shops, but few would recognize them as the factory floor staple they once were. While bloaters provided protein, suet pudding delivered pure calories in their densest possible form. This heavy boiled pudding combined beef fat with flour and water, creating a filling so substantial it could anchor a small ship. Suet pudding was the Victorian equivalent of a calorie bomb, except the bomb was wearing a tiny top hat and monocle and calling itself dessert. The versatility made suet pudding a kitchen essential. Savory versions included chunks of meat or kidney wrapped in a suet crust and boiled for hours. Sweet versions substituted treacle or dried fruit, creating treats that could fuel a worker through an entire shift. The famous spotted dick is nothing more than suet pudding with currants, though Victorian workers would have considered it a special occasion treat rather than everyday fare. Factory families made suet pudding in enormous batches. A single pudding could be sliced and reheated throughout the week, providing reliable fuel when other foods ran short. Modern concerns about animal fat eventually pushed suet pudding toward obscurity, though it survives in Christmas puddings and the occasional nostalgic pie. Potted meat was Victorian food preservation at its most ingenious. Workers and their families took whatever meat scraps they could find, pounded them into a smooth paste, packed the mixture into small pots, and sealed the top with a thick layer of fat. That fat barrier prevented air from reaching the meat, allowing it to last for weeks without refrigeration. Potted meat was the Victorian equivalent of Spam, except it was actually made from real meat, probably. The beauty of the system lay in its simplicity. Any leftover meat could be potted. Beef, pork, game, or combinations thereof all worked equally well. Factory workers bought small pots of the stuff from street vendors, spread it on bread, and consumed concentrated protein without needing to cook anything. Records from the era suggest that asking too many questions about ingredients was considered impolite. The meat was cheap. It was filling. That was enough. What made potted meat particularly clever was its portability. Workers could carry a small pot to the factory, eat directly from the container during their brief meal breaks, and dispose of nothing but an empty vessel. If Victorian foods had slogan competitions, potted meats would be, "Don't ask, just eat." Modern food safety regulations eventually made traditional potted meat largely obsolete, though commercial versions survive in tins on grocery store shelves. While potted meat made mystery ingredients palatable, brawn made the inedible essential. Also known as head cheese, despite containing absolutely no cheese whatsoever, brawn represented Victorian thrift at its absolute peak. Brawn is what happens when Victorian cooks looked at a pig's head and said, "I bet we can get at least 3 more meals out of this." The preparation was straightforward, but labor-intensive. Cooks boiled an entire pig's head for hours until every scrap of meat fell from the bone. They picked out the cheeks, tongue, ears, and any other edible bits, chopped everything finely, and packed it into a mold. The natural gelatin released during boiling set the mixture into a firm, sliceable loaf that could be eaten cold for days. Nutritionally, brawn delivered impressive value. The collagen from all that slow cooking provided protein and nutrients that expensive cuts couldn't match. Brawn was the Victorian equivalent of nose-to-tail dining, except it was mostly just nose. Families passed down brawn-making skills through generations, each household developing their own seasoning preferences and techniques. Modern squeamishness about eating recognizable animal parts eventually pushed brawn toward obscurity. Few grocery stores stock it today, and most people have never seen the dish their great-great-grandparents considered a Sunday treat. Saveloys were the Victorian equivalent of hot dogs, portable, questionable, and somehow perfect at 11 at night. These bright red sausages appeared wherever factory workers gathered. Street vendors set up outside factory gates at shift changes, selling boiled saveloys to hungry workers who needed something fast, cheap, and filling. The distinctive scarlet color came from saltpeter, which both preserved the meat and gave saveloys their eye-catching appearance. What made saveloys successful was their deliberate mildness. Unlike strongly flavored foods that divided opinion, saveloys were designed to appeal to everyone. The seasoned pork filling was savory without being challenging, satisfying without being memorable. Factory workers could eat them quickly without utensils while walking to their next destination. If foods could have job descriptions, the saveloys would read, "Provides adequate nutrition with minimal fuss, no questions asked." The rise of fish and chip shops eventually pushed saveloys toward obscurity. As fried fish became the dominant street food, vendors who once sold sausages outside factories found their customers disappearing. Saveloys survive today mainly in chip shops that serve them deep-fried, a preparation that would have seemed wasteful to Victorian workers who ate them simply boiled. While saveloys offered mild convenience, bread pudding delivered bold sweetness. This was the dish that proved Victorians could turn literally anything into dessert if they added enough sugar and desperation. The concept emerged from necessity. Bread went stale quickly in Victorian homes without modern storage. Rather than waste it, thrifty cooks soaked rock-hard bread in milk until it softened, mixed it with sugar, dried fruit, and suet, then baked the whole thing into a dense, sweet treat. Bread pudding was the Victorian equivalent of composting, except instead of fertilizer, you got cake. Every household developed their own variation. Some families added spices, others increased the dried fruit. The wealthy used butter instead of sweat, but the basic principle remained constant across all social classes. Stale bread plus sweetness equaled dessert. For factory workers, bread pudding represented one of the few sweet foods available. Sugar had become cheap enough that even poor families could afford occasional treats, and bread pudding maximized sweetness from minimal ingredients. Children waited eagerly for bread pudding days, knowing that the dense, fruit-studded slices meant something special. Modern bakeries eventually killed traditional bread pudding. Once fresh bread became cheap enough to throw away when stale, the economic logic of the dish collapsed. We essentially stopped making dessert from garbage because we could finally afford to waste things. Sweet treats were rare, but the final survival foods show the strangest lengths Victorian workers went to fill their plates. Eel pie is what happens when your local river is too polluted for nice fish, but still produces something edible. Victorian London had a complicated relationship with the Thames. The river was notoriously filthy, filled with sewage and industrial waste that made most fish impossible to eat. Eels, however, thrived in those murky waters. They seemed immune to conditions that killed everything else, wriggling through the pollution and growing fat on whatever they found. Eel pie was the Victorian equivalent of making lemonade from lemons, except the lemons were sewer eels and the lemonade was somehow delicious. Londoners turned this ecological oddity into a culinary tradition. Dedicated eel pie houses served thousands of workers daily, baking the slippery fish into pastries with parsley sauce. The shops clustered around factory districts, providing hot, filling meals to workers who couldn't afford anything fancier. A single eel pie could fuel a man through an entire shift. The nutritional value surprised even Victorian doctors. Eels are fatty, protein-rich, and packed with nutrients that other cheap foods couldn't provide. If fish could win awards for overachieving in terrible conditions, Thames eels would have swept every category. The tradition survived into the 20th century as pie and mash shops, though most now serve minced beef instead of eel. Thames cleanup efforts reduced eel populations dramatically, and modern diners generally prefer not to think too hard about where their food once swam. While eel pie came from questionable waters, sheep's head came from a different kind of challenge entirely. This meal required a certain Victorian mindset, the ability to look dinner directly in the eyes and proceed anyway. Sheep's head was the Victorian equivalent of extreme couponing, except instead of clipping newspapers, you were boiling skulls. Butchers sold sheep's heads for pennies because wealthier customers refused to buy them. Factory families saw opportunity where others saw horror. A single head could feed a family for 2 full days when prepared properly. The preparation took hours. Cooks boiled the head until every scrap of meat fell from the bone. The cheeks provided the choicest pieces. The tongue was considered a delicacy. Even the brain was eaten, though usually only by those who didn't think too carefully about what they were consuming. The boiling liquid became rich broth that stretched into soup for days afterward. Nothing went to waste. Victorian families extracted every possible calorie from that sheep's head, making the gruesome investment worthwhile. Modern squeamishness eventually ended the practice, though sheep's head soup survives in some traditional cuisines around the world. Tea and toast might seem too simple to count as a survival meal, but for Victorian factory workers, this humble combination represented something essential. A moment of warmth in an otherwise brutal day. The ritual was straightforward. Weak tea, made from leaves that had already been brewed once or twice, poured into chipped cups. Toast, sometimes spread with dripping if the household could afford it, eaten quickly before the next shift began. Tea and toast was the Victorian equivalent of sad desk lunch. except the desk was a factory floor and the lunch was bread they couldn't afford to butter properly. What made tea and toast significant wasn't its nutritional value. It was the break itself. Factory owners eventually learned that workers performed better with brief rest periods, and tea breaks became one of the few guaranteed pauses in 14-hour shifts. Workers gathered around kettles, shared whatever they had, and experienced something almost resembling leisure before returning to their machines. Sugar played a crucial role. Cheap Caribbean sugar made bitter, overbrewed tea drinkable and provided a quick energy boost that exhausted workers desperately needed. The combination of caffeine and sugar became almost addictive, creating habits that shaped British culture for generations. If beverages could claim credit for building empires, tea would have a surprisingly strong case. Unlike the other foods on this list, tea and toast never really declined. It simply transformed. The survival meal of Victorian workers became the comforting ritual of an entire nation, served in cafes and kitchens without anyone remembering its origins in factory desperation. From bread and dripping to tea and toast, these 15 survival meals powered the factories that built the modern world. Workers stretched every penny, used every scrap, and turned poverty into culinary creativity that fed millions. They ate stomachs and heads, mystery meat pastes, and polluted river eels. They made desserts from garbage and spread butter so thin it barely existed. Most of us have never heard of half these foods. The meals that kept entire cities alive have largely vanished from our kitchens, replaced by convenience and abundance that Victorian workers could never have imagined. We've gained refrigeration, fresh vegetables year-round, and food safety standards. But we've also lost something worth remembering: the knowledge of how to make much from little, how to waste nothing, how to survive on creativity when money ran out. 15 cheap meals fed an empire, and somewhere along the way we forgot how clever our great-great-grandparents really were.